Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Doyle Hodges, the executive editor of TNSR, and in this week's episode of Horns, we're discussing the field of national security law. The podcast is being recorded at the 10th Annual National Security Law Conference, hosted at the Army's Judge Advocate General Legal Center and School in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'm joined today by Professor Laurie Blank from Emory University and Professor Bobby Chesney from the University of Texas at Austin. Our goal is to discuss the question of national security law not in a specific way in terms of the details of what comprises the issues of the day, but really to take a look at why it is that we view national security questions largely through a legal framework, how that came to be and what its implications are for how we consider the questions, the options that presents to us, the things that it closes off from us, and maybe what some of the alternatives are. So before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to each of our guests to give a brief introduction to sort of explain how their perspective is informed on this issue and how their experience does that.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. So I think this is a great question. We can start by thinking, when I teach this, I start by asking my students, what is national security? We don't even get to the word law yet. We just want to understand what's the substantive topic that we're then applying law to. And I think that topic is so enormous that almost anybody can find an entry point where they find some interest, right? When you think about what does it mean for the government to protect the national security of the nation, you can obviously get into force and war and things like that, but we get into energy and economics and finance and technology, intelligence, trade. And then we think, okay, well, how do you do that in a rule of law state? And that's how we enter the topic. And we try to keep that thread going throughout the semester. And I think that applies almost to anybody reading the news or watching the news or digesting the news, whatever the correct format is these days, how you ingest news. On some very base level, we rely on our government and society as a whole as that's the fundamental social compact, right? That you join a society and then you can band together to protect yourselves better than a single person. And so if we want to rely on our government to do that, we want to think about, okay, well, what are the parameters?
So I think that's totally right. It's great to be on the show with you guys. Good morning. When I think about this, I usually look at it through the point of view of the various institutions of our government that are responsible for implementing the more coercive aspects of statecraft. So obviously military activities, and I would include also, of course, the activities of the intelligence community. You can't stop there, of course, because there are elements, say, of the Treasury Department, and I'm thinking here of the Office of Foreign Assets Control. There are pockets of other parts of our government that are also part of this story. And then there's a complex intersection with law enforcement, too. There's a great deal that prosecutors and criminal investigators do that concerns our national security. So when I think about what is the general scope of the field, what is it that I'm expecting students who claim an interest in this area to actually be interested in, maybe you can sum it up by saying I think of it through an institutional lens. And then each of those institutions is shot through with legal frameworks and lawyers for that matter. And our job is to give the students the best possible understanding of the origins, underlying forces, underlying considerations, current structure of the legal authorities that both restrain what these institutions do, but also, and this is really critical, also enable and validate and legitimize what they do.
So that question of legitimacy is an intriguing one. One of the questions that I presented to you guys as we were framing the debate is that we live in a time when confidence in institutions associated with the law is declining over time. If you take a look at the confidence in institutions poll run by Gallup or Harris or none of these other institutions, you see confidence in Supreme Court declining from around 50% in the mid-1970s to around 38% today. Confidence in Congress, the lawmaking body, declining from about 40 to 45% to 11% today, which actually is an increase from where it was just a few years ago.
Hey.
Conversely, confidence in the military, an institution closely associated with national security, has gone in the other direction, going from a low in the 50% range to around 73% today, which is actually down a little bit from its high in the 2008-2009 timeframe. So a question is, what's the source of this legitimacy that we place in law? Why is it that a legal framework lends legitimacy and structure and trust when the trust in the institutions and mechanisms of law seems to be declining, but our reliance on these things in the national security space seems to be increasing.
So I think that it's a mistake to equate confidence in the idea of the rule of law with the current state of confidence in the Supreme Court as such, or Congress especially. Yes, Congress is sort of the lawmaking institution at the federal level, not the only one in certain complex ways, but the central one. And yes, the Supreme Court has the last word on the interpretation of federal law. But there are reasons for the declining confidence that we're all familiar with over, since the general collapse in the confidence in institutions in the United States and elsewhere in the 70s. That's part of the story. I don't think that means that people have lost interest in the idea of embracing the rule of law as such. I think if anything, it might reflect growing concern in the public's mind about the extent to which those particular institutions actually share that value. So in other words, if we step back one level and assume there's an abstract value that's adherence to the rule of law and all the goods that come from that, which, by the way, in my conception is one of the central defining characters of what our country actually is all about and what makes America special, then there's a next step consideration of how good are the various institutions that are relevant for this. How do we feel about the court system in general, particular courts? How do we feel about various lawmakers? How do we feel about law enforcement? How's the FBI doing these days? How's the Justice Department doing? All those things can rise and fall, possibly in relation to the public sense that they're not actually doing their job vis-a-vis the rule of law. I think for the Supreme Court, that is part of the story, and it's declining public confidence levels in the polling you cited, because the public's more aware today than it used to be, in part because of the spectacle of confirmation hearings and the visibility of politics in that process, and then the periodic mega cases where people have deep policy or probably more often partisan commitments. They've identified that the outcome is supposed to be X for my team and Y for the other person's team. And if it doesn't go their way, then therefore it must be political. Or maybe an honest merits assessment that something the court did looks more political than law interpretive. And when those things happen, I think that for people to lose confidence is for them to say, hey, that's not as rule of law focused as I want it to be.
Yeah, I would add, when we think about legitimacy, and I think this is going to be a thread that weaves through our conversation quite a bit this morning. Legitimacy today, particularly in the national security context, is often going to be based on law compliance or a perception of law compliance. And I think maybe that's the more important piece. But one of the things I want to throw in the word arbitrary, because as I'm thinking of your question and as I'm listening to Bobby, I'm thinking, well, the opposite of rule of law, the opposite of law here is arbitrary, right? We live in a society based on the rule of law. Fundamentally, at the heart of that is that you have expectations. Law is about expectation. It's about the expectation of what's going to happen when X happens. I know if I go to the authorities, this is the set of parameters in which that engagement is going to happen. If you live in a society that's not bounded by the rule of law, you don't have those. Well, you have expectations, except they're different expectations, or you only have an expectation of arbitrariness. You don't go to the authorities because you don't know. You have no sense of limits on the parameters of that engagement. And I think we are seeing an injection of partisanship into our view of the institutions that you're talking about, whereas once we might have retained that idea, that sort of bigger picture rule of law, legal framework idea. Part of it, I think, is we now know so much more. And by know, that's just information coming in. It may not be correct. It may not be based in any fact, but we all feel we have so much more information about what's going on, who's doing what, who's saying what their motivations are in all these different institutions. And that does muddy the waters a bit, right? You go back however many decades, we didn't necessarily have all this detailed information. You can kind of point to the early 90s as when we have the 24-hour news cycle. You start to have the internet, and all of a sudden, boy, everything is a little dirtier.
So I'm curious because, as you start talking about legitimacy, and we'll get, I think, perhaps in a bit into some of the constitutive elements of national security law, but one of the areas where legitimacy has been challenged significantly in a relatively structured and academic way is a field that I know you work extensively with, is international law and the instruments that govern the use of force internationally. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those instruments gain legitimacy. I mean, there's the argument by Posner and on the political science side by James Morrow that they're either epiphenomenal or they're reliant solely on reciprocity. But there's also an argument that there is a legitimacy that comes with them that's constitutive of the international community. And I'm wondering your views on that and how you could explain that role.
Yeah, so two main bodies of law when we're talking about the sort of assertion of military force, the use of force to protect national security. And we're talking about the law that governs when you can use force as a state, and then the law of war or the law of armed conflict, which is how you use that force. They both derive legitimacy. Their legitimacy rests on a really comprehensive web of morality and sort of history and obviously the legal structures of treaty and custom and domestic law, right? All those are woven together. But the law is not separate from tradition and morality and ethics. In fact, it literally is the manifestation of those things. So you can look at the law governing the use of force, and that traces directly back into just war theory and the religious traditions in that area. You look at the law of war, this has the most ancient pedigree of certainly any international law, except, probably goes back way beyond piracy, law of the sea, anything like that. You can find rules regarding warfare in every culture's tradition as far back as you can go, as far back as any culture can go, anywhere, any written text, any oral text. It doesn't necessarily look like the law we have today, but the notion of rules, parameters, restraint, authority in war is a very ancient concept. And so at a minimum, legitimacy comes from that. But then, right, where we are today is we see much more complex arguments about what is the law, what it should be. So we start to mix in existing law with what lawyers call lex ferenda, the law as it should be, our aspirational law. And often the inability to tell those two apart in conversation can then really complicate the conversation. From my perspective as an international lawyer, I have no doubt that the law has legitimacy. I don't struggle with that when I wake up in the morning. I realize that there are a lot of questions about it, but I don't know that those are limited to international law. I think there are obviously questions about the legitimacy of law in any situation. When we look at domestic law, we recognize the mechanisms by which law comes about. We see a legislature. We see an executive branch that signs things. We see people who vote for those different bodies. Those are things we know to recognize. You jump into international law from that space, you don't necessarily see the same road signs. You don't recognize the same identifiers. And so international law looks mushy, it looks soft, but it's actually an amazingly powerful tool. And if you look at the way states talk to each other and the way states talk about what they're doing, they're almost always talking in the language of international law. Even when they're doing something that others don't agree with, when they're trying to justify conduct that is unacceptable, they do it in the language of law, which to me is a very strong sign that the law is very powerful in its legitimacy because it's used as a legitimating function all the time.
I think there are two variables that contribute to this question that is a recurring issue of people thinking that, well, it's not really law, really. It's something else. That's just a label that's draped over states acting out of their national interest, full stop. One variable is the spectrum of enforcement. So we're not talking about laws of physics that self-implement. They're laws because that's how matter moves and works. Rather, these are constructs that, if they're enforced, start to look like law to the extent that they're enforced. And if they're not enforced, it starts to look like maybe it's not really law. It's just something somebody said, and we can actually look past that if we want to know what's really going on. That's not a binary where it's either enforced or it's not enforced. I mean, look at the analogy to the speed limit, right? So everybody understands that for the most part, the speed limit's violated more often than it's not on the highway in most places. But every now and then there's some episodic enforcement. Everyone has to slam on their brakes because there's the cop. And with international law and things like the UN Charter, especially rules on the use of force, there is this sense you often get that Well, there's just not a realistic enforcement mechanism behind there. There's one on paper, but it's proven over time in reality not to have enough bite to really merit consideration as law. It's a very cynical way of looking at it. I think that the fact that there might be a provision that is difficult to enforce because we haven't created, for better or worse, I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing, the fact that we haven't created highly effective detection, investigation, enforcement, and adjudication mechanisms to back up the UN Charter the way that we have with run-of-the-mill criminal law in a domestic setting doesn't mean that it's not law. It just means there's much more ambiguity and there's much more indeterminacy about whether in a particular case there will be effective cost imposed. That said, I think it's a caricature to treat it as if these rules are violated all the time with no consequences. The reality is there's a tremendous amount of consequence. It may not always take the highly visible form of, say, a Security Council resolution, thanks to the veto power and other considerations we're all familiar with, but rather it goes to the question of how much international cooperation or indeed resistance you might engender by proceeding in a way that other governments are choosing, or perhaps other populations are choosing to interpret as a rule violation, in which case it creates pressure on them, either external from their own politics or internal from the decisions of those other government officials, to be less willing or perhaps unwilling to cooperate with the state that's perceived as acting in violation of these norms. That sort of friction, which again is on a spectrum from less cooperation than you would have had otherwise to outright resistance and refusal of overflight rights, that sort of thing, is really meaningful. Is it dispositive? No, but the fact that it's not necessarily dispositive in every instance doesn't mean that there's not work being done by a legal framework. And if there's any work being done by the legal framework, it's pretty hard to dismiss it as irrelevant.
Can I add also 2 points to build on what Bobby was saying? We are, at least certainly here in the U.S., and I think in many sort of similarly situated democracies, we're very accepting of the limits and challenges of enforcing domestic law. I don't think we tend to question the existence of domestic criminal law or the speeding traffic rules or tax laws because there are countless violations that are not caught, enforced, prosecuted, et cetera. We don't need to spend our time this morning recounting the data on how many murders don't get investigated or prosecuted or convicted or who gets to manage to sneak around their taxes. But we don't question the existence of law domestically because we see those indicators, right? I think Bobby's mentioning a bunch of indicators in the international law space. We just aren't trained to identify them. And they don't really look that consequential often. So another state decides to take aggressive action against its neighbor, not allowed under international law. You would think what we're looking for is, everybody bands together and kicks them out, a la 1990, 1991 with Iraq and Kuwait. The world doesn't always allow for that type of response because of geopolitics, because of military capability, because of any number of things. So we might see any very comprehensive web of sanctions and all of a sudden trade deals not really going through and any number of things. It's just we don't recognize them. We don't see them. And so it looks like, they're getting away with it. But when we see people getting away with it domestically, we don't immediately run and shout, there's no law. So it's an interesting sort of, it's not a balance or a dichotomy, but it's just this strange disconnect between the two.
So a critic might say, well, okay, take the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and taking of the Crimea as an example and say, well, yeah, sure, there's lots of sanctions and pushback, but that's just states pursuing their national interest. Well, it is, but you don't have to choose one or the other and say, well,
Exactly.
it's only law if states did it despite it not being in their interest. I think that the way that law most often works is specifying rules where there will then be consequences that are meant to reflect certain social commitments, as you were saying earlier, Laurie. This ideally will seem exactly like what interest would favor anyways. It's not a perfect match, but I just think you can't dismiss it on the ground that, well, of course, they wanted to oppose the Russians anyways.
Not to necessarily continue the straw man of, law isn't relevant in these things, but one of the elements of conventional wisdom is the adage that, in times of war, the law falls silent. And yet, over the last 20 years, as we've been engaged in the most prolonged, sustained armed conflict of our history, it seems like our laws and regulations in the national security space have multiplied. And I'm curious what you see as the driving forces behind that, what the interests are that are being balanced as we do that, and what the effects are in addressing these issues from a legal perspective as compared to, say, how we addressed security questions and regulation questions during the Cold War, where we didn't have as robust a mechanism of national security law. I'm just curious on the perspective of that.
So I'm going to push back and say that's not conventional wisdom, certainly not in the space of conflict, right? That is obviously a very well-known statement. It is relied on to say, oh, well, war, how can you have law? But I'm going to push back on that. And starting in the space of conflict and war, what's quite interesting is I would say factually, right, this is humans at their most violent, their most bloody, most chaotic. You would expect there wouldn't be law because how could there possibly? And yet, if we look solely at the actual law that exists, I could pile it up on this table that we're sitting at, and it's enormous. The number of treaty provisions and laws that actually apply during wartime. And this is international law, which means states have sat down and agreed to these rules. These are not rules that somebody else came up with and said, hey, states, why don't you follow these rules? They look really good during wartime. The only way we get international law is that states sit down and talk to each other and agree. And so it's actually a pretty remarkable thing when you think about it. And so starting in that space, I think law is enormously relevant and consequential because on some level, the more brutal, the more horrific, the more power we're talking about, the more force we're talking about in a particular situation, in essence, the law is needed more and more, right? And so in essence, the law has been for centuries, and particularly since the 1860s when we see the outgrowth and outcropping of modern international law regarding wartime, the law has been keeping pace. It's running fast as it can to keep pace, right? Developments in war, we need to keep the law going, and it's always responding. When we move out of the actual war space into the bigger national security space, I think we can add a bunch of other maxims, and I'll let Bobby fix, whatever I'm going to quote off the top of my head, right? But think of Justice Rehnquist's book, All the Laws But One. Think of, which goes back, of course, to Lincoln's statement with respect to suspending habeas corpus in the Civil War. Should we let all the laws go unchecked, but in order to enforce just one? And I think there is a perception that government does whatever it needs to do. There are times that it does, but even when it does, think of some of the worst things that we think of in our history as the moments when, oh my gosh, stain on our history, Korematsu, right? The Japanese internment camps. We now study that case as this is what you don't do, right? Not just morally, but legally and everything. And yet, what's both interesting and a little scary is that actually was done through legal orders and through the court system. It was a horrible result. And by no means should we look back and say, oh, no, there were some good things about that time, right? But even when we get it wrong, we're not getting it wrong because we're throwing arbitrary power out there. We're getting it wrong through the legal institutions, through the legal system, which means we got to do better with those legal institutions and legal systems. And maybe that's why we've seen so much more reliance on law.
Laurie, your example highlights something that I often talk about with students in the context of, say, Nazi Germany, where you've got all these legal apparati and they're functioning. It's the content of certain of the laws and then the actions undertaken under them that are so morally repugnant and horrific. And that underscores that to say that there are laws and legal institutions doesn't tell you anything about the moral quality or the policy desirability of what's reflected in that. So we got to avoid the temptation to assume that legalizing things and being legalistic about them necessarily entails certain things we'd find attractive. It might be the opposite. On this question, so Cicero says inter arma silet leges, and it's generally taken as a shorthand for, so all bets are off, all rules turned off. So as an initial matter, that's not necessarily what it means, right? Because the law isn't one set of rules that's on and therefore requiring the same set of behaviors by the state at all times. The legal framework can have and does have a ton of flexibility within it to deal with different degrees of exigency. And we see this all the time in ordinary circumstances of law enforcement and handling circumstances within a domestic setting, like, say, a prison riot. The Supreme Court has held over time that the constitutional constraints on government behavior that are embedded in the Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause have to be taken in the totality of the circumstances. This is a line of cases that comes up when there are civil litigations after some use of deadly force, for example. You got to take the circumstances into consideration, and if it's exigent enough, then that which would be forbidden to the government is much less than would be the case in ordinary peacetime circumstances. Looking at the laws of war, the whole idea that there's a body of the laws of war is predicated on there being conditions of armed conflict, at which point things which would never be the rule in ordinary, say, law enforcement circumstances involving, for example, the use of lethal force as a first resort when you've positively identified a member of the enemy force, that would never be the rule under peacetime circumstances, but you can do it if certain conditions are present. And that's the law that brings us to that place and helps ensure that those real people who have to make these really difficult decisions can understand that they're operating within a considered framework. I mean, this is something, here we are at the JAG School. This is such a central idea. And in our discussions at this conference yesterday, this came up with some of the topics we were addressing. In a world in which we realistically are not going to get reciprocity for, say, detainee treatment from, the Taliban, why do we do it then? Well, it's not about them. It's about us. And in particular, when it comes to the laws of armed conflict, it's about the warfighter being put in a position where they have the reinforcement of the infrastructure of law to know what they're being asked to do and what they're then going to do was the right thing, the legal thing, the moral thing, and that they can sleep at night with a clean conscience if they're adhering to this framework. This is terribly important. It's certainly to our way of fighting.
So I'd like to pick up on a theme that you brought in, Laurie, initially, and that is, what do we talk about when we talk about national security law? We've focused to a degree now on international instruments related to law of armed conflict, and those clearly have a national security component. But there's so much more that gets considered in that, and I'd be curious where you define and delimit the scope of national security law and what isn't national security law.
Well, I think if you put the question that way, where do you define the limits? That's actually quite hard, because if you teach a course in this area, the first thing you have to do is try to take what may be the widest ranging topic we can think of and an enormous casebook and figure out, what do I do with this over 14-week semester? Which things do I teach, right? One solution is what Bobby and his colleagues have done, which is to teach a lot of courses, right? You have a survey, but then you have enough folks who can teach a variety of this. So you have, in essence, just a huge package. For most folks, you end up focusing on the stuff that grabs that ties in with other things where you spend your time. My national security law course naturally spends a bit more time on war and the use of force and the sort of military instrument of power than somebody else who maybe is more interested in some of the civil rights aspects of national security law. So there's lots of ways to go at it. One of the things that I try to do with my students is I want to tie national security law to national security and to what we think about when we think about the government creating a favorable national security position for the state. Because that's one of the fundamental things that the government is trying to do, is not just protect against threats that are coming in and pinging at us, but you actually want to create a favorable national security posture so that you're in a good position with respect to other states in peacetime, not just sitting there waiting to defend like a hockey goalie. And so I also introduce my students to the whole concept of the instruments of power, which is what you would learn in a strategic studies course in military doctrine. And, I don't spend a lot of time on it, but I want to make sure they think about, why is the government doing things and how does it act, right? And so usually we use the acronym DIME, right? The instruments of power. You have D for diplomacy, I for information or intelligence, M for military, and E for economic. But I usually talk about them a little bit out of order because it makes better sense, I think, at least in the way we want our states and our governments to act. We want to go we want to think about the D, the I, and the E before we get to the M, ideally, right? So, hopefully you're not just, and that's a common conversation. Are we using our military too much for our foreign affairs? Is it becoming a tool of foreign affairs policy as opposed to, maybe a more constrained space? Where are we using the other, instruments of power? But I want them to think about when the government does things. If you want to act in the realm of diplomacy, okay, now we're talking about the foreign affairs power, and then we can get into conversations. What is Congress's role? Does the president have, free reign? All these different things where you start to bring in separation of powers in the Constitution, and it's like, oh, we talked about this in other classes too. Oh, wow, I see some weaving together of my life in law school and what it means, right? I'm not just sitting in siloed things, right? We want to actually see how things tie together. And then we talk about, the information instrument, and we say, well, what about sanctions and things like that? And okay, now we're at a place where we can't solve this unless we bring out, to use a pun, the big guns, right? In essence, in actuality. So I want them to think about that a little bit. One of the things I like to do, and I think most people who teach this topic probably do this, is I start every class by talking about the news. The biggest challenge is to actually get to the topic you have assigned that day, because it's not unheard of to say, oh my gosh, 30 minutes just went by and we've been talking about the news. But if you bring in the news, I have them come in and they have to raise their hand. What I don't assign anybody anything, but just what's happening in the news. I throw it out there, and there's, 8 or 10 students in every class who really then get engaged, and they raise their hand every morning and they want to tell you what's going on. And then we begin the art of, okay, how do we look at this as a lawyer, right? Okay, you told me a lot of facts, and some of them are funny and some of them are disheartening and some are interesting and some are salacious. Okay, what's the legal question going on here? What's happening here? And they start to think about this like a lawyer. And I'll sometimes say, okay, you're Congress's lawyer. What are you arguing here? Okay, someone be the president's lawyer. Argue back, make some arguments here. And before you know it, we're actually having class, except they think we're just talking about the news.
I completely agree. I think that's one of the joys of the course. It also highlights a really important point about what's in scope for national security law over time. It changes in part because what's going on for the nation is changing. And if you look at pre-9/11 versions of this course, which there weren't a lot of, I mean, there were pioneer institutions like Duke and UVA, where people like Scott Silliman at Duke and Bob Turner and John Norton Moore at UVA had been teaching national security law with sort of the traditional late 20th century perspective in the late 20th century, reflecting a lot of the issues that arose in the 70s, which was a big formative period, both in terms of the Vietnam War generating a ton of attention to the full spectrum of military-related topics, from civ-mil relations to war crimes to the role of the law of armed conflict program that was then emerging in the aftermath of Vietnam, domestic separation of war powers, the war powers resolution. And then, of course, you've also got the creation of FISA and various intelligence-related developments of the 70s. And so in the 80s and 90s, national security law was really about all that stuff. And, of course, all those things continue to be part of national security law. But what happens, of course, after 9/11 with the great surge of interest in our field and the rapid expansion of both the number of courses being offered and the number of faculty like Laurie and I who come into the field and teach a variety of courses in this area, and I have an anecdote I'm going to share in a minute, remind me to come back to it if I don't, is the intervention of non-state actors emerging on the scene as strategically significant actors that are being dealt with as sort of first-tier national security threats. Now, this brings to bear a whole set of issues and institutions that wouldn't necessarily have been in scope before, because now we really need to look at a variety of things relating to what comes to be called homeland security, things involving border control, things involving the immigration laws, the investigative powers of criminal investigators, the prosecutorial options. To talk about the material support law in 1999, when the 96 Act was 3 years old, nobody'd know what you're talking about except for a few specialists. But that's like bread and butter national security law, is understanding how material support is used as a counterterrorism tool these days. So this sort of post-Westphalian moment where where non-state actors became so much bigger players on the world stage, as part of national security properly understood, has really affected what we teach and how we can teach it. More recently, we've had the surge of cybersecurity. And there's an interesting intersection with national security, but obviously cybersecurity is a much broader topic. It just intersects with, it's not fully subsumed within national security. The anecdote I wanted to share was, I wanted to become a law professor in the late 90s and wanted to teach what I would today describe as national security law. I wanted to write in that area. And I couldn't get any interest at all from any of the schools I was interviewing with. In part, that's just a reflection on me and my relative attractiveness as a candidate. I get that, but it also reflected the topic. And I know this because I gave a talk at one place about what at the time felt like an extremely obscure thing, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And I was talking about some Fourth Amendment issues. And after the talk, which I thought had gone well, after the talk, one of the faculty members escorts me out, kind of puts a fatherly arm over my shoulder and says words to the effect of, "Son, that was a nice talk, but you really ought to focus on business law, because this thing, national security law, it's Tom Clancy stuff," is what the guy said. Not a proper fit, legal domain. Now, it's easy to laugh at that now, but it speaks volumes about the narrow understanding that prevailed previously. But I think that's because at that time, national security as such wasn't as much in the news as it's been every day since 9/11. And the range of things that people were conceiving of as in scope was just narrower. It was statecraft only, it seemed to many people. I recognize there were exceptions.
To build on that, on some level, we can thank governments for some of this constant, growth and interest, because in the aftermath of 9/11, understandably, right, it's an understandable reaction for a government. The U.S. government pretty much used national security and terrorism as the reason for absolutely anything it wanted to do. I want to prosecute this person. Well, I'll just call them a terrorist. I want to do this. I'll just say we're at war with terrorists. I mean, I'm slightly,
you sound very cynical,
a little glib, right? But think about those first few years after 9/11. There were enormous reaches of government authority based on a threat to national security, based on, quote, the war on terror, right? And you would hear things again like, well, we're at war with these folks, right? This is the war on terror. I don't actually know what it means to have a war on terror, right? To put it in either political science or law terms, it doesn't really, you can't actually have that, doesn't mean anything. So all of a sudden, there were so many more areas where people who ordinarily would have advocacy and legal tools to push back against government assertions, I'm not even going to say whether they're overreaches or not, just government assertions of authority, are now being brought into the national security realm. They wouldn't have thought of themselves as doing national security law, but all of a sudden they are, because national security kind of was this huge blanket that got thrown over so many things because we were in a high danger, high threat environment.
I probably have a less cynical view of the extent to which we were doing that, but I think you put your finger on something really important, and it makes me want to amend something I said a moment ago. We do have prior moments in history, certainly in American history, earlier in the 20th century, where domestic events that may or may not have been accurately identified by government personnel as being the threat they think it was. And here I'm thinking, of course, of communism panics in the Red Scare in the 50s and also sort of post-World War I, those two waves, where a lot of the things that I just a moment ago was saying really weren't in scope for national security pre-9/11, immigration laws, run-of-the-mill criminal investigation, that sort of thing. In those windows, those would have been, using our categories, those would have been national security issues of the day then as well. And so I think actually what we've really identified is there's waves. It comes and goes. And when the headlines are filled, when the government's focused on threats from within the United States, then an array of otherwise seemingly domestic affairs or border-related affairs become central to national security law and legal frameworks and institutions. And then there are waves when we become primarily focused on great power competition, large-scale armed conflict, and then our minds tend to shift the category towards those more traditional categories.
Can I throw in one other piece And I think there are folks who study this phenomenon and could offer enormous commentary on this. So I just want to throw it out there. There's just a big difference in the world of the internet and social media and much greater transparency and the tools that advocacy groups have and the tools that ordinary citizens have to see what is happening or might be happening, what we think is happening, what the different perceptions are. It's a little bit akin to the enormous shift in consciousness that happened when war came into people's living rooms with the Vietnam War. All of a sudden, war reporting was on TV. Wow. Huge change, right? And I know, right, in the political science world, in the sort of social science world, you can see that. We are having also a moment like that. It's a long moment. But in the aftermath of 9/11, governments could not take action, take care of things, do what they felt they needed to do for protecting national security in ways that they might have been able to do several decades ago, where it would take a while for the public to actually figure out and learn what was happening. Not because even the government was being sneaky about it. We know that happens sometimes too. But just because you didn't have the constant access to information, to video, to news, to whatever it was that we have now. We're oversaturated. Now we actually, I always tell my students, you've got to read at least 3 sources before you possibly could know whether a news story, what's fact, what's perception, what's anything, right? We don't even know now when we read the news exactly what is fact, whereas we were in a different situation however many decades ago. But the pace and the amount of information, it's really interesting in the armed conflict space, where now you have reporting on military operations, incidents, airstrikes, because someone has a cell phone there and they post a video. That has enormous consequences for the law and how we talk about the law. And I think it's also had enormous consequences just for the pace of interest and development in national security law.
So in this topic, I hesitate to bring it up a little bit because we're starting to run short on time, but it's been kind of in the background of the last several comments, is even as we've experienced this fundamental shift in a conception of security that I think followed 9/11, we also are experiencing a long moment of a fundamental shift in how we relate with information and technology. And I'm curious if you could both comment on how national security law adapts to changing technologies and whether it has sufficient tools and expertise to do so, or whether there are areas where we need to reevaluate how we approach these questions.
So it's often said that formal law is much slower to change than technology in today's environment, and that's obviously true in many contexts. And if you look at a commonly cited example would be the way that FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was written in 1978 with a lot of talk of radio and wire and certain built-in understandings and premises that 20, 30 years later, at least some people felt no longer matched up very well with how communications technology actually worked. Other people like to cite the 1986 Electronic Communication Privacy Act, which has a key premise built into it about the way that electronic communications are stored for certain media and what it means for 180 days to pass. So it's true that law is slow to keep up with technological change. I think this point gets overstated in terms of the significance of this. When it's true that law is slow to change in general, formal law, and historically when there are changes in cultural preferences, when there are changes in morality or what's perceived as morality, it can often be a long and painful process to undo some prior reflection of the previous morality or commonly shared idea that got embedded in law. And eventually you see maybe in some cases multi-year, maybe multi-decade processes of change. So that's the nature of a system that is slow to change. One of the virtues of the system is it's not precipitous change. And I think that there's trade-offs and you're never going to have a perfect system. When it comes to national security and technological change, the things that jump out, of course, include the emergence of remotely piloted vehicles, which for at least a while there seemed to be all anyone wanted to talk about. and very fiercely held opinions in some quarters about how this changes everything, and other people saying it changes nothing, and fights go on from there. This isn't novel. I mean, the emergence of submarine technology had a similar effect. The emergence of airplanes had a similar effect. The emergence of nukes had a similar effect. It's actually, going back to Laurie's point earlier about the deep roots of the laws of war, the emergence of the English longbow had in proto-legal frameworks had an effect where, there were those who argued that's wrong for these non-noble participants in fight to shoot from a distance with weapons that can kill an armored knight, because that's just not how it ought to be. So this is an old story, and I think it's not a problem. It's just a description of how law takes in, through many different dimensions, input that sometimes results in change and sometimes doesn't. But technological change has always been a driver of legal evolution. And I think once you accept that law is not static, but in fact is a reflection over time of all these different forces, then of course it would be that way. Unfortunately, a lot of people just assume that law is some sort of fixed North Star, that's it's always there, and that somehow it's all been locked in. And that's not a very realistic way of thinking about law, period, in any context.
So I just want to raise two areas to build on what Bobby was saying. And I think as a preface, this is what makes life interesting, right? Because you actually have to start to understand what these new developments mean to be able to take the law you either know or have or think about and figure out how it works, how it means. So it makes life interesting for sure. But I want to throw out two areas quickly where I think we see some interesting debates and consequences. And I don't throw them out as critiques. I throw them out as, wow, let's be alert to what this means. So one of them is in the area of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and the current environment of social media has really put some really interesting pressures on our understanding of freedom of expression. And so there's a lot going on, not only in the substance of what speech should be protected, what speech should be allowed, things like that, but also who's doing that. And so we see some interesting dance moves going on between governments and the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Google or all these other ones. Who is the one who should be regulating or moderating content? So we see some really interesting maneuvering going on in that space, right? Both legally and morally, right? Who should or could or can or et cetera. So that's one area where I think we are in a transitional moment. We're in a really fascinating moment, and I would say watch that space for one. Another area where the pace of technology and capabilities is putting a stressor on the law. Again, I think it's interesting. I think we want to be alert to it, is in the law of armed conflict space. The ability to have information, however correct or not correct, but particularly visual information immediately in the aftermath of some military action is really presenting a real challenge for how we think about the law and how the law develops. Because very briefly, when we think about the lawfulness of a particular use of force during armed conflict, so an attack on an enemy headquarters or a building or an enemy personnel or whatever it is, right? Convoy. We have certain rules for how that has to take place, basic fundamental rules of the law of armed conflict. Now, those all apply to the decision at the time of the attack. They are prospective. We analyze the lawfulness based on what the commander knew at the time, what the information was that was available, so on and so forth. When you then have information that is immediately transmitted to the world, and the information is awful, right? Someone is dead, things are destroyed, people are weeping. I mean, it's hard, right? It's the tragedy of war, immediately beamed around the world. It's very hard to then use the measured legal methodology of how you analyze, because the immediate word out there is death, destruction. There must be a war crime here, right? And so we end up having what's called the effects-based analysis, where the legalness, the lawfulness of something is being judged based on what happened, what appears to have happened, right? Which is now putting a stressor on the law. And so that's been really interesting to watch, especially when we bring in the advocacy efforts, which are incredibly important, but can often use that effects-based moment to great effect, but maybe not to the great benefit of the law. And so that's, I think, something to be alert to. And I think it ties back, I'll just sort of circle it back to that initial question of legitimacy. And right now, the legitimacy of military operations, of state action, is very much based on the perception of compliance with the law, right? It should be based on compliance with the law, but it's often just as much based on perception. And that's, I think, maybe an interesting sort of wrap-up point, right? Which is that we need to be alert not just to what the law is, but what people think the law is, how they understand it being applied. And so you got to know more. You got to know some political science. You got to know some morality. You got to know all these things to be able to try to pick apart that tangled knot.
Let me jump in on that because I think it's a really interesting point, and I can give another example of it from the intelligence side of national security law. The point being that there's a critically important difference between what's perceived to be legal and therefore perceived to be legitimate and therefore won't run into so much friction, and that which might actually be legal, but if there's a gap there, this can be a problem. And NSA encountered that in a huge way with the Snowden event of summer 2013. Famously, there were all sorts of activities, but especially the metadata, bulk collection of telephone metadata that get exposed, that come in for huge amounts of criticism. And the response internally from within NSA is, hey, this was authorized by the FISA court, and we had a set of arguments. We went through the process. We followed the formula. What's the problem here? And the problem was that even if that was correct, and I think by their lights and from the process they were within, they were correct, but the public had no idea because A, it wasn't transparent, so the public wasn't aware at all that this was taking place. And to the extent that it was known to a few people, it was pretty limited. Nobody on the outside had guessed that this was happening. Ben Wittes and I wrote a piece, I think, for the New Republic at the time that said when the two big expose topics came out early on, one having to do with 702 collection and the other having to do with what we now know of as 215 collection, the bulk metadata, we said, look, anyone who works in this area already knew or assumed that the stuff that relates to 702 was taking place. This isn't news except to people who weren't paying attention. So it's a mistake to treat that as a big expose. But the bulk metadata, that surprised us. We both studied, and I taught this stuff, and I really wouldn't have guessed that they were embracing a bulk reading of the statute. And therein lies the wellspring of all of the endless friction they then encountered.
Yeah, and I think that is a really interesting point and a good one to wrap up on, is that we often turn to law as an embodiment of what we think ought to be, but it doesn't necessarily reflect in how we perceive things as the justice or the desirability of the outcomes that we see there.
Yeah, and we really need information, and we need to figure out how we process information. And I just throw out to sort of a little aphorism to tie up the two stories and examples that Bobby and I were giving. It's attributed to Winston Churchill, but I believe it's not actually Churchill. Someone said it before, right? But we all know the expression, right? A lie is halfway around the world before the truth even gets its boots on. So change that to what we're talking about. It's not even lie. A perception is halfway around the world before the facts actually get their boots on, right? Change it a little bit. We're not talking about whether people are lying or telling the truth. We're literally talking about whether information is based in reality or is based in perception.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for participating in this conversation. I could easily see this going on much longer, and fortunately, we'll be able to participate in the remainder of the conference and pick up on these topics. But thank you for sharing your views and your thoughts on this with our listeners. Our guests today were Professor Laurie Blank and Professor Bobby Chesney. I'm Doyle Hodges, and thank you for listening for Horns of Dilemma.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.